Now, last April at Star Wars Celebration, we first learned about something called Project Luminous, which we were told was going to be a large-scale, interconnected publishing effort that involved several different companies, and it came with the tagline, "The Force is what gives a Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things, until," which, of course, other than the until part, was a line spoken by Obi-Wan to Luke in A New Hope. And something else he told Luke during that scene was that the Jedi Knights had been the guardians of peace and justice in the Old Republic for 1,000 generations. And when you figure a generation is usually considered to be about 25 years, that means the Jedi have been around and doing their thing for a very, very long time. And so when one of the first things officially announced about Project Luminous last night was that line about the Jedi being the guardians of the Old Republic for so very long, was one of the driving forces behind this idea, that they wanted to explore what that looked like, I find it a little odd that Project Luminous will only be going back and taking place 200 years before the Skywalker saga, when the Jedi, theoretically, have a 25,000-year history that could be explored. I also find it a little odd that the other premise this will be built around, that their eureka moment came when, and this was apparently Kathleen Kennedy's idea, the question was asked, what would scare a Jedi? And before I continue here, let me say that yes, there is a lot I like and find interesting about Project Luminous, or should I say the idea or concept behind it, because until the books and comics actually start to come out later this year, August to be exact, we have no idea how good or bad this will truly be. And for those wondering, and there does seem to be a lot of confusion about this, all this are books and comics. There are no plans for games, movies, shows, and whatnot, not at this time. Though I believe they said or implied that could change if this initiative ends up being popular with the fans. So, again, to be clear, this is not the time period the next movies will be set in or anything like that. Anyway, getting back to it, again, I find it a little odd that this is based on the question, what would scare a Jedi, when we all know fear is the path to the dark side. Now, I'm not saying a true Jedi never ever should get scared or feel fear or anything like that. After all, Luke in The Rise of Skywalker tells us that confronting fear is the destiny of a Jedi, and I actually like that line. I'm only saying that it's the wrong reaction to fear which can lead them down a dark path, like it did in the prequels when they learned the Sith were back and promptly found themselves mixed up in a war. And so if this is a threat that the whole Jedi Order is quote-unquote scared of, and they maybe overreact to it, I can only assume the ultimate goal of this story or project is that it'll show us how, in 200 years, the Jedi go from what are described as Knights of the Round Table at the height of their power defending the realm, to the order that we see in the prequels, one that's at the beck and call of the Republic, one that's weakening and ripe for manipulation, one that ultimately gets defeated by the Sith. And speaking of the Sith, will we maybe see them working behind the scenes in this, as their final plans come closer and closer to fruition, as seen in the prequel trilogy with Darth Sidious? 200 years before the Skywalker saga takes place, is starting to flirt with the time period of a Sith like Darth Tenebrous, who was actually recently made canon in The Rise of Skywalker. So maybe we see his master in this? Then again, for better or worse, probably not. Not only were we told the main villains in this are going to be something called the Nihil, who were described as space Vikings, with the saying, "You can't take it with you, but we can take it from you," but we probably won't see any Sith in this because the idea behind Project Luminous seems to be to explore a time period free of anything else seen or done before, to create something brand new and original, well, other than the concepts like Jedi and the Republic and so on. Anyway, even the old expanded universe didn't really cover this time period. It didn't cover much in the 1,000 years before the prequels while the Sith were gone or thought to be gone. Maybe because they didn't think people would find much interest in a time period that the Jedi were free of the Sith, that it was assumed not much of importance or relevance had happened in this time. I don't know, all I know is the expanded universe didn't really expand on this time period. Which is then likely one of the reasons why they're going with it now. There is very little previously established material here for people to get mad about being contradicted or overwritten. They feel free to do whatever they want. However, with it being relatively close to the Skywalker saga, at least in the grand scheme of things, putting it 200 years before instead of, say, 500 or more, makes me believe part of the goal will be to, again, explain why the Jedi of the prequel era lost their way, what went wrong in the years leading up to it. which I do think is a cool idea or concept to explore, and I wouldn't mind a few books or stories about that. But making it this huge initiative, one where the goals seem to be to showcase or explore a completely new era, separate from the burden of beholding itself to previously established material, or having to line up with events close to it, that I don't know about. I don't know if this time period was the right choice for something like that. Because personally, and you're of course always free to disagree with me, these are just my opinions on the matter, but personally, I'm more excited to see the transition, to see what goes wrong and leads to the Jedi of the prequel era, more so than I am to just enjoy this as its own story. And honestly, I think something in the distant past or distant future would have made much more sense for such a large-scale original project, than something, again, relatively speaking, so close to the Skywalker saga. Because they're not unlimited or free to do whatever they want here. We know exactly what the galaxy will be like in 200 years. This is also being described as a time of great expansion, that this is like the golden age of the Republic, that only now are they really beginning to expand outward. The Jedi of this time are also being described as Texas Rangers as they patrol the wild frontier, which again just makes me wonder what happened in the 200 years leading up to the prequels. Why in those movies the Jedi seem to have little or no interest in the frontier and don't give a damn about something like slavery in the Outer Rim. Now, I'm not saying that the idea of Jedi patrolling the frontier isn't cool in and of itself, or that I don't like the idea of them also being more like Knights of the Round Table, that the Order is more like a brotherhood than what we saw in the prequels, perhaps. Because before the prequels ever came around, that's more what I imagined the Jedi to be like, a smaller, tight-knit organization that patrolled the galaxy, and so it's great that we're going to get to see them in that way. But again, I find the timing odd. You'd think much of the exploring and expansion of the Republic would have happened prior to 200 years before the Skywalker saga, and really makes me wonder what in the hell they're going to do with the old Republic time period someday. I mean, at the very least, why not go back like 800 to 900 years to shortly after the Sith were defeated in the last war and thought gone forever? Wouldn't that make more sense for this type of story? Wouldn't that seem like a more likely time for expansion and for a golden age to come about? Wouldn't that also give them more cushion to do whatever they wanted, to not worry about lining up with the way the Jedi would be in 200 years, and to instead imply something else would or could go wrong many, many years down the road? Again, the idea here seemed to be to have the freedom to do whatever they wanted. Instead, they've picked a time when we know the fall of the Jedi is rather imminent, that things have to change relatively soon to align with the way they'll be in the prequels. Again, unless the point or part of the point is to show that fall, which I thought wasn't the overall point of such a project. I thought this was to tell a new story separate from anything and everything else. And so I'm just kind of confused by all this. Another thing I'm confused by is the level of careful planning and cooperation going into this. Not saying I'm upset by it, I think it's awesome actually, but why wasn't this done for the sequel trilogy? Why, for some books and comics, did you get together a room full of talented, passionate Star Wars fans and authors to kind of hash out what would be done with this time period so that they could come together to tell one large, cohesive story spread over multiple mediums? But the sequel trilogy was just given to two guys who clearly did not have a shared vision, and where all the other sources of canon around it felt like either complete filler or was meant to patch up problems with the films. And no, we know this isn't an idea that sprang up from the failure or lack of planning and vision with the sequel trilogy, because they told us the idea for Project Luminous had come about in 2014, which means they knew and understood the importance of planning and sharing a vision then, but didn't think it was important to have in the sequel trilogy? And yeah, I know, Disney wanted to start cranking out movies as fast as possible to recoup that $4 billion they'd spent on Lucasfilm. But imagine if they'd slowed it down and done something like this for the sequel trilogy. Imagine if they'd taken the time to sit down and hash out all the details before just getting to work on the movies and letting the individual writers and directors figure it out as they go, essentially winging it. Imagine if all the books and comics that had come out around it actually felt relevant and like one small part of a giant interconnected story. And don't get me wrong here, I am excited about Project Luminous. The interconnected concept is great, and I like that they're considering this like an incubation process, that they can start ideas in books and comics that perhaps form a backbone for future movies and shows. It makes sense to lay the foundation with some of your more hardcore fans, those who will actually read all this stuff, or at the very least keep up with it via YouTube videos or whatever, and then to make movies for everyone from these times, places, and characters that are already established. What I don't know about is going only 200 years before the Skywalker saga and patting yourself on the back and claiming this will be some totally new and unique time period, when that's very debatable, when we know we're going to see a character like Yoda in these stories, and also know exactly where the story has to end up in 200 years. And so really, only time will tell how good or poor this ends up being. I'm neither going at this with blind faith nor hopeless pessimism. I'll wait until we actually get some of these stories before any sort of final judgment is made. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to weigh in on Project Luminous. Are you excited, disappointed, or somewhere in between? Is this a time period you're eager to see explored, or were there better options? Whatever you think, leave a comment below, and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.